My name is Bill Thomas. I'm a writer, consulting producer, and now podcaster. I am now trying to use my experience as the brother of a murder victim to help other victims of violent crime. I'm working on a book on the unsolved Colonial Parkway murders, and I'm the co-administrator of the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook group together with Kristin Dilley.
My name is Kristin Dilley. I'm a writer, a researcher, a teacher, and a victims advocate, as well as the social media manager and co-administrator for the Colonial Parkway Murders Facebook page with my partner in crime, Bill Thomas. We're starting off with breaking news, which will not be breaking by the time this episode releases, but still, we're very happy about it right at this moment. We are very excited to learn that Prince Andrew has been stripped of all of his titles.
He can no longer call himself His Royal Highness because he's a sleazebag.
The first thing that I said to Bill was, Mommy got mad at him. And I think that's probably pretty close to the truth, is Mommy got mad and took away his titles. And good, you sleazeball. You don't deserve to have titles.
After the prince, he said, rolling his eyes audibly, got caught up in the Jeffrey Epstein, Ghislaine Maxwell scandal involving sex trafficking of underage girls, the Queen had pushed him out of a public role with the royal family. I don't know about you, Kristin. I don't even have a lot of use for the idea of royalty. These are people who hundreds or thousands of years ago killed tons of other people so that they could declare that they were royalty. And that's honestly what kings and queens are about. We may find them very interesting now. I find them a bit archaic in the year 2022. Other people.
You were about to say 2021, weren't you? You had to catch yourself, didn't you?
I'm pretty committed to the 2022 thing. I haven't managed to write any checks that had last year's date on them or anything like that. But I don't write very many checks either.
Yeah, I'm having a hard time writing down the year the way that it should be. It doesn't normally take me this long, but it's happening.
Well, I do find sometimes when I'm making notes, I stop for a second, like I probably did just a moment ago. So Prince Andrew has been pushed out of ceremonial duties with the royal family and now has been stripped of his titles. He is still 9th in the list of succession, but I don't think that's a likely outcome for him to end up as the King of England. And apparently people in the UK are really disgusted with him. People have been quite vocal about just how sleazy they think he's been. They are pretty disgusted with him. And interestingly, the royal statement said that he was going to be defending himself in this legal battle with Virginia Giuffre as a private citizen. They made it very specific. It was like only a 3-sentence statement, but the final sentence was that he was defending himself in his current lawsuit as a private citizen.
Like, couldn't happen to a nicer guy, could it?
No. We're also hopeful that the guilty verdict that was conferred on Ghislaine Maxwell a few weeks ago will hold. Not one but 2 jurors were foolish enough to do interviews afterward where they discussed the fact that 2 of them had been victims of sexual abuse. There's certainly nothing wrong with talking about the fact that someone might have a sad history of being abused. However, the 50-question questionnaire that they filled out, there was specifically questions about whether or not you were a victim of sexual abuse. And that likely would have been a disqualifying event. What seems unusual is I know one of the jurors, who's referred to as juror number 50, was not asked questions about sexual abuse that he might have suffered. Usually a defense attorney, if you check yes to a question like that, will then ask you about it. They do have the right to ask that you not participate as part of the jury. I understand it. It's much in the same way that I've been in the jury pool before. I've never been selected, but I can pretty much guarantee that I was selected to be on a murder trial, and we got to the question about whether or not a family member of mine was the victim of violent crime. I would have to say yes, because my sister Kathy was murdered as part of the Colonial Parkway murders. And I can pretty safely say that no defense attorney wants William Thomas to be on the jury for a murder trial when I have personal and sad experience with losing a loved one to violent crime. I do understand it. They want people who are going to be fair and somewhat neutral and hear the evidence. There's some question about the Maxwell trial and what will be the result. I guess we just have to let that process unfold.
Of course, we will continue our coverage on the Ghislaine Maxwell trial and whatever else that might unfold as the days go on. But we are thrilled to hear about Prince Andrew this afternoon. I'm not saying that we were doing backflips, but I will definitely imply that we were doing backflips because this is pretty excellent news.
Which leads us on to the topic at hand.
Yes, we are covering the third in our series on exonerations. The exonerations that we've covered so far, Anthony Broadwater for the rape of Alice Sebold and the four men known as the Groveland Four, all happened right around the same time in mid-November. I remember opening my news feed day after day and going, whoa, another exoneration. Whoa, another exoneration? This is crazy. I wanted to make sure that before it got too terribly much further into the year, we did talk about all of these exonerations. And today's is, I think, probably the most significant out of these, although all of them are quite important. This is the exoneration of the two men who have been wrongfully convicted and held in jail for assassinating civil rights leader Malcolm X. And because I know that last time I needed a little bit of boning up on my legal terminology, I want to make sure that we take a minute and make sure that everyone understands the term exoneration. So I'm going to quote here from the National Registry of Exonerations. Exoneration means a person has been exonerated if he or she was convicted of a crime and, following a post-conviction re-examination of the evidence in the case, was either declared to be factually innocent by a government official or agency with the authority to make the declaration, or relieved of all consequences of the criminal conviction by a government official or body with the authority to take such an action.
And as you were saying last time, it's very different than a pardon. This is actually reversing the decision that led to the conviction and basically wiping the slate clean. This isn't just showing mercy and letting someone out of jail or declaring someone to be free. This is actually saying we were wrong and you are fully exonerated for the crime for which you were convicted.
Yes, exactly. And the organization that spearheaded this particular exoneration is one that is near and dear to both of our hearts, and that is the Innocence Project. And we were absolutely thrilled to learn that they had taken on such a high-profile case. And so we are going to talk about the Innocence Project's efforts to exonerate the two men who were wrongfully convicted and incarcerated for the assassination of Malcolm X.
So just a quick overview of the Innocence Project. The Innocence Project was founded in 1992 by two attorneys, Barry Scheck, who you've seen on a number of high-profile cases, and Peter Neufeld. They set up this organization as a not-for-profit organization to take a look at convictions. Since 1992, they have seen 367 cases where they have been successful in seeing individuals exonerated. About half the time when they pursue an exoneration, that individual is exonerated. They are among the people that have really been very innovative in using DNA, especially, to help investigators go back and take another look at investigations and convictions and make determinations as to whether these individuals should or should not be in jail.
The numbers of people who have been wrongfully incarcerated is absolutely staggering. I took a little bit of time to browse through the Innocence Project's website earlier today, and those numbers are just staggering. It really does make you think about the efficacy of the criminal justice system in our country if that many people have needed to be exonerated. And I'm sure that there are hundreds or even thousands of people who write to the Innocence Project every year asking for them to take a look at their case.
According to the Innocence Project, about 3,000 prisoners write to them every year. In any given year, they are reviewing 6,000 to 8,000 convictions to make a determination as to whether the Innocence Project will get involved. They're not able to get involved in everything. Although DNA is very helpful, DNA is only available in about 5 to 10% of the convictions that currently stand. It is something that they look at a lot of cases, but they only will try to move forward in cases where they feel like they can make a clear case as to why this individual might have been wrongfully convicted. Their clients are about 99% male and about 90% minority. One of the criticisms of our justice system is that it doesn't really seem to be colorblind. It's certainly very striking how often these individuals are minority and how often they are wrongfully convicted.
It is very striking. Now, the case that we're going to talk about today did not have a DNA component to it. This case is really just a straight up example of railroading. And the more research that I did on this case, as with the Groveland 4 case, the angrier I got, because it is easy to see that these two men were absolutely railroaded and convicted with no evidence against them.
It was very much a product of its time, I would say.
Absolutely. I will admit that I had to do a certain amount of background research here because I didn't know a lot about Malcolm X. I know the name, of course, because I've always heard it said in the same breath as Martin Luther King and the Civil Rights Movement. But I did not have a lot of background on Malcolm X or what he stood for. So when we decided to cover the exoneration, I had to do a deep dive to figure out what do I need to know? And also, what can I share with our audience? Because I know that not everyone is from the U.S., of course, we do have a nice international audience growing every year. Thank you very much for that. And it's entirely possible that we have people who might not be aware of who Malcolm X is. Just a little bit of background, first of all, on Malcolm X to get us started. And then we'll get into the crime of which they were accused and convicted. And then we'll get to the exoneration. Malcolm X was born Malcolm Little. He was an African-American minister who was a member of the Nation of Islam. He was a human rights and civil rights activist who was known for his role in the civil rights movement. He advocated for the importance and ideals of Black empowerment, and he held the idea that racism was ultimately the greatest foe to African Americans. Malcolm X became acquainted with the ideals of the Nation of Islam during his stint in prison in 1946. He was imprisoned for breaking and entering and larceny. Ultimately, he was paroled in 1952, and from that point forward, for about a dozen years, give or take, he was the face for the Nation of Islam. Now, a little bit about the name. I had no idea what the X stood for, so I had to do a little bit of research on that too. The X, Malcolm X, stands in for his unknown African ancestral surname. Malcolm X espoused several views that put him at odds with the other members of the civil rights movement. Unlike MLK, he resisted the idea of nonviolent resistance and racial integration. He has a famous quote where he said he believed in the liberation of African Americans, quote, through any means necessary. And presumably that did include some struggle or possibly even violence. He also felt that it was important for the total separation of Black and white Americans, and for Black Americans to have one portion of the country where they could prosper and thrive away from white Americans. And that wasn't necessarily an ideal that gelled with the other leaders of the civil rights movement.
I'd also add that some of his rhetoric, which was quite powerful, was very threatening to the white establishment of the time. I remember as a kid reading about Malcolm X, and this idea of by any means necessary was something that a lot of conservative white Americans found very threatening.
Definitely would say that is true. So Malcolm X ultimately, despite the fact that he was the face of the Nation of Islam and vastly improved its membership over the years, he did eventually become disillusioned with its ideals. And he broke from the organization after Elijah Muhammad, who was the founder of the Nation of Islam, suspended him from that organization. And a certain amount of that had to do with the fact that he made some comments after JFK's assassination that left a little something to be desired. And at that point, Elijah Muhammad said, how about you not? And so Malcolm X left the Nation of Islam and created the Islamic Muslim Mosque, Inc., or the MI. He also created the Pan-African Organization of Afro-American Unity, or OAAU. As a result of the issues that he had with the Nation of Islam, there's increasing differences. He also received an increasing number of death threats, to the point that he actually started to take his own safety and security pretty seriously. Unfortunately, the folks at NYPD and the FBI did not take it as seriously, and we'll get into that. We did learn, I was surprised, and then I realized I should not have been surprised, to learn that Malcolm X was surveilled by the FBI starting in the 1950s, pretty much up until the day that he was assassinated. And that surveillance actually began when Malcolm X wrote a letter to President Truman expressing his opposition to the Korean War, which would be fine, except for the fact that he also declared himself a communist, and that was not okay. So in 1953, after he started becoming a high flyer and a rapid riser in the Nation of Islam, the FBI's surveillance switched, and they realized, okay, we're not concerned about him as a communist. We're concerned about him and the fact that he is suddenly a high flyer in the Nation of Islam. This is a problem for us. The NYPD began surveilling Malcolm X after he spoke out on behalf of a Nation of Islam member named Hinton Johnson, who had been severely beaten by police in New York City. So Malcolm X went to the police station to demand that Johnson be taken to a hospital after his beating, and then demanded that he be let out on bail, which ultimately he was not allowed to do. At the time that Malcolm X arrived at the police station, a crowd of over 500 Nation of Islam members also arrived in support of Malcolm X and their fellow member. They were starting to get a bit rowdy out there, and ultimately Malcolm X had to go outside and dismiss the crowd, especially when it became clear that the police were just going to hold Hinton Johnson. A New York police officer spoke to the New York Amsterdam News after watching Malcolm X interact with his crowd, and he said, "No man should have that much power."
I think there's an implication there that no black man should have that much power.
Yeah, definitely. So after that incident, the New York Police Department put surveillance on Malcolm X. And at that point as well, the NYPD ordered undercover officers to infiltrate the Nation of Islam. So throughout 1964, as he was starting to gather a substantial following in the civil rights movement, especially among the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, he started receiving death threats of all kinds. His car was bombed in February. In March, Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, told Louis Farrakhan, who was also high in the organization, hypocrites like Malcolm should have their heads cut off. The issue of Muhammad Speaks the following month featured a cartoon of Malcolm X's severed head bouncing around on the ground. In June of that year, the FBI received a tip that Malcolm X is going to be bumped off. That's a quote. And then also in June, Malcolm X's home in Queens was destroyed by a fire. And at that point, after a year of intense threats, in February of 1965, Malcolm X did tell a reporter that the Nation of Islam was actively trying to kill him, which all leads us up to the assassination of Malcolm X. So later that month, in February of 1965, February 21st to be exact, Malcolm X was assassinated in the Audubon Ballroom in Washington Heights, where he was addressing the Organization of Afro-American Unity. He was gunned down as he was speaking on stage in front of his pregnant wife and 4 daughters. Now, 3 men charged the stage as Malcolm X was speaking. One man who was known as Talmadge Hire, also known as Mujahid Abdul Halim, charged the stage with a sawed-off shotgun and shot Malcolm X in the chest. 2 other men charged the stage as well, but they were firing semi-automatic handguns. Malcolm X did have bodyguards, and Halim was shot in the leg by one of them and apprehended, but the other 2 gunmen were not, and that is important for the story. Ultimately, Malcolm X was shot 21 times total and pronounced dead at 3:30 in the afternoon. 3 people were charged with assassinating Malcolm X. Mujahid Abdul Alim, who we mentioned already, he is now 80 years old, still alive, and was paroled from prison in 2010. Also arrested was Muhammad Aziz, formerly known as Norman X Butler. He was paroled in 1985 and is now 83 years old. And Khalil Islam, known formerly as Thomas 15X Johnson. He was paroled in 1987 and has been deceased since 2009.
You're listening to Mind Over Murder. We'll be right back after this word from our sponsors. We're back here at Mind Over Murder.
Here's the problem with Aziz and Islam being charged with Malcolm X's murder. They weren't in the ballroom. They were nowhere near there. As a matter of fact, Halim, who did confess at his 1966 murder trial to shooting Malcolm X, he even came out and said neither Mohammed Aziz nor Khalil Islam was involved. He flat out said it. He did not name the other gunman. He said, I will not do that, but I will tell you that neither of these men was involved. And yet, still, somehow, with alibis, no evidence, and nothing else, these two men were convicted of the assassination of Malcolm X.
It should also be noted that NYPD had officers, plainclothes officers, undercover in the auditorium. We believe that the FBI had undercover agents in the auditorium at the same time. Everything I've heard and read said that it was quite a chaotic scene with bullets flying and the audience diving for cover as the assassins made their way towards the front of the stage. It doesn't even appear that these two gentlemen were even in the room when the assassination took place. There were three gunmen, but Alim made it very clear in his testimony that there were two other gunmen, but that he wasn't going to specify who they were, but it wasn't either of the two gentlemen who were charged. The whole thing seems incredibly problematic and compromised from the word go.
Definitely. And the 1966 trial was not the only time that Mr. Halim said these two guys who were sitting in jail, they had nothing to do with it. In 1977, in an affidavit, Mr. Halim said he and four other men with ties to a mosque in Newark, New Jersey, had decided to kill Malcolm X because he was a hypocrite who had gone against the leader of the Nation of Islam, Elijah Muhammad. He stated unequivocally for the second time that Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam were not involved. But despite this, the case was never reopened. Unreal.
Yeah, the whole thing is just such a problematic prosecution.
Again, there was no evidence. Both men provided alibis. They were both at home at the time of the shooting. They had all sorts of people around them who said they were at home at the time of the shooting. You had the actual shooter saying, yeah, they weren't involved. For some reason or another, Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam ultimately spent a combined 42 years in prison, which included significant time in solitary confinement. Mr. Aziz was released on parole in 1985, as I stated earlier, and he returned to his 6 children. 2 years later, Mr. Islam was released and reunited with his 3 children, and ultimately he died in 2009, though both men have worked to clear their name. Interestingly enough, the case came back onto the radar of the Innocence Project after the Netflix documentary series Who Killed Malcolm X compelled a witness who identified himself only as JM to come forward with information reaffirming that Mr. Aziz did in fact have an alibi. So after the release and screening of that documentary series in 2020, that witness came forward and says, he did have an alibi. I can tell you he did. I was there with him. And that sort of moved forward this exoneration process as a result of that documentary.
It's yet another example of the power of media and how we can see something like a documentary, Who Killed Malcolm X, highlight the issues involving this wrongful conviction, and that helps move it back onto the radar of people like the Innocence Project.
So now let's move on to the exoneration. The exoneration happened on November 19th, 2021. It ultimately led to the men being exonerated based on the findings of a 22-month reinvestigation, one that began in January 2020. The result of that reinvestigation uncovered evidence that supported their alibis and basically proved their innocence. The reinvestigation and ultimately the exoneration was a work between 3 different bodies: the Manhattan DA's office, led by Cyrus Vance Jr., the Innocence Project, and Shanney's Law. Very interesting what all they came up with. And I feel like this is something that is going to make an excellent book one of these days, which I, of course, will read. There is a lot of information here that made me sit back and go, this is very interesting. I want to offer a quote from Barry Scheck, the co-founder and special counsel to the Innocence Project. He said, quote, "The assassination of Malcolm X was a historic event that demanded a scrupulous investigation and prosecution, but instead produced one of the most blatant miscarriages of justice that I have ever seen." So during this reinvestigation, Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance reported out on a couple of very interesting things. First, he started by saying that since the time of the assassination, every eyewitness, every police investigator, and every trial attorney on the case has died. He also noted that all physical evidence, including the shotgun, is gone, and no telephone records were obtained at the time or are obtainable now. So there's not a whole lot here left to reinvestigate. What they did find was Vance also reported that investigators found that many important papers, including parts of the DA's file and some NYPD records, were lost, and complete records of the identification procedures conducted by the NYPD were missing. Also missing were lineup photographs, copies of photo arrays. There were no reports detailing what methods police and prosecutors used. In short, there were no records of anything related to this particular case. Quote, "In short," this is from the motion now, quote, "it is unknown whether the identification procedures used in this case were properly conducted."
It seems like everything has conveniently disappeared.
Very conveniently disappeared. However, there is a good part to this. And again, this is from Manhattan DA Cyrus Vance. He said that in the course of the reinvestigation, his office obtained numerous materials it tragically did not have at the time and did not turn over to the defense, including dozens and dozens of reports from the FBI and the New York Police Department's Bureau of Special Services and Investigations. Now, this is where it gets really interesting. NYPD files unearthed in the investigation include information about a call to the New York Daily News reporter on the morning of the shooting, indicating that Malcolm X was going to be killed. However, there were no uniformed officers present at the event.
And this is a man who's under active surveillance by undercover NYPD officers. It's amazing.
It really, truly is. I'm going to directly quote from the Innocence Project brief on this. FBI and New York Police Department documents were found that would likely have led to Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's acquittal had they been turned over at the time of their 1966 trial. These documents not only contained information that pointed to people other than Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam, but also revealed that undercover NYPD officers were in the ballroom and witnessed the shooting, but prosecutors did not disclose that information to the defense.
Amazing.
This is so fishy. It's so fishy. It also states in the Innocence Project's brief that the undercover police officers present at the time of the crime did not testify at Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam's trial.
Even though they were in the room when the assassination took place.
And according to some of the FBI files that were uncovered, there are reports revealing that on the orders from Director J. Edgar Hoover himself, the FBI ordered multiple witnesses not to tell police or prosecutors that they were FBI informants. Absolutely stunning.
You almost don't know what to say.
Yeah, it's absolutely crazy. So I assume there is very much more to these findings. Based on the information that I have, the research that I did, that is only like a fraction of what was brought forward. But ultimately, it was Manhattan Judge Ellen Bibbin who dismissed the convictions of Aziz and Islam. She stated, "I regret that this court cannot fully undo the serious miscarriage of justice in this case and give you back the many years that you lost." And it was noted that as the motion to toss out the convictions was granted, the courtroom burst into applause.
Long time coming.
Very long, half a century. A quote from Mr. Aziz, "I do not need this court, these prosecutors, or a piece of paper to tell me I am innocent. I am glad that my family, my friends, and the attorneys who have worked and supported me all these years are finally seeing the truth we have all known officially recognized." I hope the same system that was responsible for this travesty of justice also takes responsibility for the immeasurable harm it caused me. We also have a quote from Khalil Islam, who is Mr. Islam's oldest son. He said, "My father's exoneration is a welcome but long overdue relief to our entire family. We are pleased to see justice finally being served, but it is heartbreaking to know that he passed away without ever seeing his name cleared for his wrongful conviction. To the day he died, he never stopped fighting to prove his innocence." And Mr. Islam's other son, Johnson, said, "I honestly did not think I was going to live to see this day." You really don't know what to say at a certain point. How awful.
Remember we talked about how people like Malcolm X were a flashpoint. He was articulating an anger and a disappointment in the American system in a way that seemed very extreme to people high up in our government. People like J. Edgar Hoover and the top people at the Justice Department and in the NYPD were very threatened by someone like Malcolm X and the approaches that he espoused. In addition to creating a lot of tension among higher-ups in law enforcement, then you have the dynamic between Malcolm X and other leaders within the civil rights movement, but especially within the Nation of Islam. I think that Malcolm X's radicalism had created almost a perfect storm where he'd probably made too many enemies with his brilliance and his outspoken nature and his calls for black and white separatism. I think it created a situation where he had enough enemies all over the political spectrum who wanted to see him taken down a peg, if not eliminated. And that's where we see other members of the Nation of Islam deciding that he was being disloyal to their principles and their leadership, and therefore he had to go. And this is at a time when there was a very high level of violence inside and outside our country. By the end of it all, you have bullets flying in a crowded ballroom in Washington Heights in New York City.
I think one of the things that it's important to remember is that now that these two men have been exonerated, there are still two people out there who did get away with assassinating Malcolm X. And Malcolm X's third daughter, Yasa Shabazz, had this to say after the exoneration. "Today, history will document that Muhammad Aziz and Khalil Islam have been cleared in connection with the murder of our father, Malcolm X. I hope this long overdue vindication will bring a measure of peace to Mr. Aziz and his family and to the family of Mr. Islam. However, my family still seeks justice for the murder of our father."
I totally get where she's coming from, but with each passing year, I think it becomes less likely that the perpetrator or perpetrators are still alive, unless someone comes forward with new information, which is possible, that indicates who the other conspirators were. I think it's going to be very difficult to put names to who these other two gunmen were and who actually masterminded, if you will, what was clearly a political assassination.
The Innocence Project Director of Special Litigation, Vanessa Potkin, did have something to say on this subject. She said, "We think of Malcolm X as this icon of history, and you might assume that because of his importance and influence, that it would have motivated authorities to go above and beyond to get to the truth and figure out who killed him at the time. But in fact, it's both because of and in spite of who Malcolm X was that seeking justice for his murder, the murder of a Black activist who spoke out against police brutality and systemic oppression, was not a priority in the 1960s. And it does lead you to wonder if it is still not a priority today.
I'd have to agree with that. And I think a lot of people may take the let sleeping dogs lie attitude regarding Malcolm X's brutal assassination in New York City.
I was interested to learn that in January 2019, members of the families of Malcolm X, JFK, MLK, and RFK were among the dozens of Americans who, quote, signed a public statement calling for a Truth and Reconciliation Commission to persuade Congress or the DOJ to review the assassinations of all four leaders during the 60s. I would really love to see what would come of that commission, if there were one. As with all major cases, there is always the conspiracy theory element, and there is actually no shortage of conspiracy theories when it comes to who precisely is responsible for Malcolm X's assassination. Again, something that I was interested to read and learn about is the COINTELPRO program, which the public learned about in the 1970s. For anybody who's not familiar with it, COINTELPRO stands for Counterintelligence Program. And this was a series of projects conducted by the FBI, and it was meant to surveil, infiltrate, discredit, and disrupt American political organizations, especially ones that the FBI deemed to be subversive. So that would have included, for example, feminist organizations, the Communist Party, anti-Vietnam War protesters, civil rights movement, Black Power movement, environmentalist movements, animal rights organization, even the KKK. There was this whole counterintelligence program, COINTELPRO, and the FBI does not come out looking too terribly great because of that. There was the bombshell that John Ali, who was the national secretary of the Nation of Islam, was actually a former FBI agent. The FBI had said they wanted to send surveillance into those parties. Well, they did. And Malcolm X had actually confided to a reporter that John Ali exacerbated tensions between him and Elijah Muhammad, and that he considered Elijah, quote, his arch enemy within the Nation of Islam leadership. Jumping on the conspiracy wagon here, John Ali had a meeting with Talmadge Hayer, the convicted assassin that we know was there, the night before the assassination. The two of them met.
It's not a crazy conspiracy theory if it really happened.
No, I agree. Now, in a 60 Minutes interview during May 2000, Louis Farrakhan stated that some things he said may have led to the assassination of Malcolm X. Quote, I may have been complicit in words that I spoke. I acknowledge that and regret that any word that I have said caused the loss of life of a human being. He did say later, I didn't order the assassination of Malcolm X, but he said he did, quote, create the atmosphere that ultimately led to Malcolm X's assassination.
Some wordsmithing going on there. He says he created the atmosphere, but he didn't order the assassination.
The more that you look at the COINTELPRO program and the more that you learn about the FBI informants who were in the ballroom and who may have been there at that time period, and then this FBI agent, John Ali, who had met with Talmadge Hayer right before the assassination, I don't know, the more you think that, yeah, this was a political hit, this was an assassination, and the FBI must have known about it in some way, shape, or form.
And the NYPD, who were also surveilling members of the Nation of Islam and were in the ballroom at the time of the assassination. And it was stated publicly that there was likely going to be a hit on Malcolm X. It's possible that many of these leaders in law enforcement were perfectly content to let whatever was going to happen unfold. He was regarded as an enemy of the state, and there's not much way around that.
It sure does seem that way.
I think they were perfectly content to let these black activists whom they regarded as a threat shoot it out effectively.
Just an awful thing all the way around. But I was so glad to hear that Mr. Aziz and Mr. Islam have finally been exonerated after so long. Unfortunately for Mr. Islam, it was posthumously, so he was not ever to learn of his actual exoneration. But I was so pleased to hear it, although I'm, again, speaking from a place of privilege, I'm shaken that it took this long. I guess the more research that I do into this, maybe I'm not so shaken that it took this long. It's just a real tragedy for everyone all the way around. I am so glad that they finally have the exoneration. And hats off to the Innocence Project for the amazing job that they did with this case. We hope you enjoyed our series on exonerations. We do have some great guests coming up over the next couple of weeks. We're looking forward to talking to Kevin Sullivan, who is the foremost Ted Bundy expert. That's going to do it for this episode of Mind Over Murder. Thank you so much for listening, and we'll see you next time. Mind Over Murder is a production of Absolute Zero and Another Dog Productions.
Our executive producers are Bill Thomas and Kristin Dilley.
Our logo art is by Pamela Arnois.
Our theme music is by Kevin MacLeod.
Mind Over Murder is distributed in partnership with Crawl Space Media.
You can follow us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram.
You can also follow our page on the Colonial Parkway Murders on Facebook.
And finally, you can follow Bill Thomas on Twitter at BillThomas56.
Thank you for listening to Mind Over Murder.